today's webinar about neurodiversity. My name is Amy McLeod and I'm consultant from HR Recruit, and I'm joined today by Robin Watson, employment solicitor from Lacey Solicitors. Robin has a lot to cover in today's webinar and will be sharing his knowledge around neurodiversity and what to consider in the workplace and practical tips and ideas. I'm going to pass you over. There will be an opportunity to ask questions in the chat box at the end. There you go, Robin, over to you.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks also for your help organising this. So I'm told that we could be about 150 before us, which I can't see anybody, so I'll just have to believe that, and that's wonderful if there is. It doesn't surprise me because with HR, I think if you mention disability discrimination updates or anything like that, I think we all know that's probably one of the biggest things we tend to fear quite often. And if you add neurodiversity in there, I can fully understand why it's something that people have an interest in, which is great. But it also means I don't know what experience there is in this virtual room. So what I've tried to do is pitch this as best I can to all levels. I'm fully aware there are HR directors here who have mountains of experience, perhaps far more than me in dealing with this, and know everything and want an update, but there may be some junior ones who are fresh to this. I think if nothing else, if you know everything, put your feet up and have a blast for an hour and remind yourself that you're fantastic at what you do. If there's anything else, I think just try and take one thing away from this. And if that one thing, like me, when I did this a few years ago now, is really about broadening your mind and broadening the way you look at HR and the way you deal with people. And a couple of stories I'll relate to you from a real life experience, and the reason why this is a subject which I think is, I would say, is something that we all need to be very aware of. I think it is something as big as mental health. I think it's underplayed, and I think neurodivergence, and we'll come on to those different terminologies, plays a far bigger part in our HR world with our people that we look after and manage than we realise, and there are many reasons for that. So one thing I'm passionate about is or two things. One is HR and employment law in a very geeky way. On the other side of it is the neurological side and personality side to HR and what we do, because we are people. We manage people, and we lead people, and protect businesses for things that go wrong. And neurodiversity, I think, is really, really important. So hopefully, in the next 45 minutes or so, I'll be able to sow some seed and say that, why don't you think about this, or did you consider this? And I'm just hoping, like me, there'll be something to say, well, I didn't think of that, but actually, I'm going to go and learn about that, or change the way I might view something. We have got a lot to get through, so I'm going to do my very best. We are skimming the surface, as you probably expect, and I make no apologies. This I would probably do in a full day's course in a hotel room with tea and biscuits and lunch, but we're ramming this into 45 minutes, so I'm deliberately skipping over some things. But there's always an opportunity with my contact details there. If you want to talk more, or think I've got something wrong, or want to disagree, that's absolutely fine. All you have to do is email me and we can talk further. Via Amy, all of the information you need will be sent out in a few days' time. So I'll be sending the links and the Q&A, and hopefully we'll be sending those out as a cut and paste, and I'll be answering those in more detail as we go along in the next few days. You should have everything you need, including the links. So you can literally just sit and listen. And if anything comes to mind, please jot it down. If there's anything you want to know more about, please jot it down and do so. So just in case you're wondering who's this clown sat in front of me, what gives him the right to talk to me, a little bit about me. So I work for Lacey's. I'm a partner in the employment team, and I head up the employment team there. And predominantly we act for employers, and we help people like yourselves from all HR levels, from HR admin all the way up to HRD level. And we help owner businesses as well, develop and deal with HR issues as they go along, and that can be day-to-day problems, but also we deal with the big stuff. We deal with the claims, disability discrimination, and all the discrimination claims as well. We deal with individuals and we help individuals. So I'm able, maybe not with, well, you can't, but I can put two different hats on this. So I can look from a claimant solicitor perspective, that's what I might be looking at as a claimant lawyer, or I might be looking at from the respondent side of things for the employer, and what comes to mind. So everything I'm saying to you today is deliberate, and it's based upon my own experience and what I think I want to tell you and should help you. So there is a lot to cover. He says, there we are. So waiting for the computer to wake up. So there's a bit of a menu there that we're going to go through. We do have to do a bit of revision, I'm afraid. So this is the revision part for most of you, I suspect, on disability discrimination. And that's simply because when we talk about neurodiversity, the reason we're talking about it is twofold. One, to give you a positive stance to take away, and to remind you or give you something fresh to look at. But the negative side of it is to be careful. And the warning I give to all HR clients now, since about 2017, I think it is, all employment tribunal cases are now listed online. Anybody can go in, search the employer or the employee, and they can see employment tribunal decisions and employment appeal tribunal decisions. And there's no wish to scare you, and I'm sure you know this, but one thing I say to people is, remember, you could be named. It's going to be very rare if I'm advising the employer or employee that I wouldn't be calling not only the decision maker in a process, but also the HR person who was advising, or the HR person who was involved, because I want to know what they were thinking as well and doing. They might not tell me, but it's worth asking. So remember that, because we all get pressures in HR, and there are pressures just to get on with it, as we're told, aren't we? Can't you just dismiss them? Can't you just get rid of them? Let's press on and get the business focused. Well, we've got to remember, yes, but also we're professionals and we've got to follow the law, because at the end of the day, we could be named in a case. And I say that without wishing to scare you. It's just the reality of where we live in. So we're going to be looking at the key aspects of disability discrimination. We're looking at neurodiversity, and I can tell you now there is no one accepted universal definition, but we will be going through a couple of those. And I said at the start, and when I did this, first of all, was, is there a problem in the workplace? Which sounds quite negative. Is there a positive problem in the workplace that we're missing? Because I want to be positive about this and encourage you to look into this more in your workplaces. Looking at best practice to avoid claims, and that's generally disability discrimination claims, but it fits nicely with neurodiversity as well. Occupational health, friend and foe. I have my own views, generally speaking. I'm sure you do as well. Sometimes they're not particularly helpful, and with neurodiversity and neurodivergent individuals, I could be wrong, but perhaps sometimes they're not as confident as we are in trying to help us with that, because it's very broad. Workplace toolkits is something that I want to share with you, and that's really passporting. So it's about passporting people and giving them a plan of how they can be communicated with, what works for them, what are they worried about with their conditions. A couple of recent cases, there are numerous cases on that to do with all sorts of neurodivergent issues, but I'm going to just give you two, and one very recent one which you should read. We're looking at making a positive step towards inclusivity and practical tips and ideas. So there's a lot to cover, so I'm going to whiz through it as in depth as I can. But let's start with our disability discrimination. Well, we all know that you can't discriminate against an employee or job applicant. We could stop there, but we go further with the types of claims that can arise. As you all know, we have positive discrimination, positive action which is allowed in favour of a disabled job applicant or employee, so we can treat disabled people more favourably. That is not discriminatory against them or those who aren't disabled. But other than that, we know that discrimination is unlawful. At the top of the scale of harm, if you like, and that's the thing as a lawyer I look at, is, well, what potentially we're dealing with, because direct discrimination under Section 13 in the Equality Act is probably the most harmful, because that cannot be justified. There is simply no lawful excuse for that. There is one, but that's out there. We won't deal with that today. But generally speaking, if direct discrimination is in play, it's going to hurt, because essentially what's happening here is you, when I say you, your employers, your clients, are discriminating against somebody because they have a disability. So it's simply because of that disability. And that's a serious claim. And that can be many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds. It's quite rare, in my experience. Many claimants will say they've been directly discriminated against, but actually what then it comes down to is maybe it's indirect discrimination under Section 19. And that's simply where you are applying a practice, a criterion, or a policy. Keep it as policy, it's easier to understand. And by applying it, you are indirectly discriminating against those with a disability or other protected characteristics, but we're focusing on disability here. So it's having more of an impact on those with a disability or shared disability, and you cannot objectively justify it. Okay, so there's a defence to these following ones, and that's objective justification, a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. We can't cover that today. If you are confused and you've no idea what I'm talking about, drop me an email, I can send you some links to help you. One that can be missed sometimes, and this sometimes happens with lawyers as well, actually, what we call the Section 15 arising from claim, and it was new under the Equality Act and didn't exist before. And that's where a claim happens because it's based on something that arises as a consequence of disability. And typically that might be dismissing for poor attendance due to the disability. And sometimes that people say, well, isn't that indirect discrimination? Well, yes and no, because these two tend to tack together and they're pleaded to the tribunal in the alternative. But it's as a consequence, something arising out of disability will be absence from work due to that disability, and that can be a claim under Section 15. So be careful of that one as well. We know if someone is disabled, and if they are disabled, as we'll see shortly, then there's a duty or might be a duty to make reasonable adjustments. And remember, it's a might. I think there's a tendency for us all to jump straight on and say we must make reasonable adjustments. Yes, we must, but it's not every single adjustment. And we can see shortly where we're going to get that help to make that decision with us. But if you don't make a reasonable adjustment, it may not be a straightforward claim if there's no substantial disadvantage. It's rare that there wouldn't be, in my view, but there are two prongs to that: the duty to make them in the first place, and if not, the employee's placed at a substantial disadvantage. Two more that always get brought into discrimination claims, and will be, I think, with neurodiversity as well, just by the way this works, is harassment. So harassment, generally speaking, could be nicknames, it could be jokes, it could be pulling somebody's leg, and you'll see maybe how that could arise with the autistic spectrum, when someone simply isn't getting or was looking at something in a very literal way, and you might get people pulling their leg. You might get managers who get frustrated and start making jokes. That can amount to harassment. And victimization is easily missed, but that can happen because somebody's made a complaint, they've made a claim, and you then do something to their detriment because they've done that. And that might be a bad reference. It might be causing them detriment because they dared to make a grievance or to make a claim against you or the company you work for. Okay. Pre-employment questions is something I get a bee in my bonnet about. I'm frequently given horror stories and see them from clients about some of the health questions that HR ask, and I'm sure it's none of you. And when I talk about HR, I include myself in that, because I should have said first, actually. Until fairly recently, I was also solely responsible for the HR within the firm in which I work. And so I have been the other side of the table with you. So I know what it's like, and I know the pain as well. But health questions is something that it does bug me, because I think there is a tendency to send out very bland standard questions, but you do need to think about this from a GDPR perspective and an employment law perspective. Why are you asking? What is it you need to know? And when I do this, I simply think about what's the role, what's the health consequences or the implications, and then I go on to ask the questions. There is a danger and a risk, potentially. There could also be a benefit in asking standard questions and see what comes back, but just be careful. So we're talking about someone with a disability, and we know that the Equality Act gives us that definition. It's somebody who has a physical and a mental impairment, and the impairment has a substantial and long-term effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So we are asking 4 questions of ourselves, and this is something I will send out to you as a little reminder, an aid memoir when you're dealing with this, or have a grievance or disciplinary and disabilities coming up. These 4 questions are really going to fine-tune for you. Does the person you're dealing with have a physical or mental impairment? Remember deemed disabilities, MS, cancer, HIV, severe disfigurements. They're automatic disabilities, so there's simply we've been no need to investigate those further. Does the impairment have an adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities? And we'll see what that might be in a minute. And is that effect substantial? And the Equality Act tells us that is more than minor or trivial. And finally, is that effect long-term? And we know that's going to be either more than 12 months or likely to last more than 12 months. Okay. Sickness, absence, dismissals, generally speaking, can be one of the most risky. And as an advisor, what I tend to get is the dismissal that's just about to happen or has happened, and I get the papers shoved on me and say, can you deal with that? And one of the most frustrating things, and I see it more often, is out-of-date medical reports, even from very big employers and big HR teams, where simply no one's addressed their mind to thinking, what decision are we making and what evidence? Because your OH reports and your expert reports, in my view, shouldn't be any more than 3 months old if you're making significant decisions. And we just had a fantastic case, literally, where are we now, 6 days ago, Judge Taylor in the Employment Appeal Tribunal, who said this. That's a case to read, and that will also show you why it's very dangerous to rely on outdated medical evidence. So current evidence on condition and prognosis is really, really important. I'm going to skip over reasonable adjustments. All I really need to say on that, of course, is not every single adjustment. You've got to go through a process to engage with the individual about why they think they need this adjustment. And it is a two-way street. I think as a lawyer, I always say to claimants and employers, it's a two-way thing. It's a conversation. It shouldn't be the employee keeps quiet and you suggest the reasonable adjustments. It's a two-way street. And you'll see with neurodiversity and passports how that might be a good way to look at it. There are always alternatives to look at, and the only thing I would say on this is whenever you're making a significant decision, especially dismissal, just think about alternatives. What else could I do apart from dismiss this individual. Okay. Hopefully that was a revision for you all, but there is a grounding for that. And I want you just to remember as we go through the next 40 minutes or so as to why I've talked about that. Two things. One is to think about how you deal with people in your own organization, even in your teams. And secondly, what you would do if a claim came in, or if someone said, I've got autism, I've got dyslexia, and I think I've been discriminated against, or I've got a grievance to make. And just think about how you'd reflect on that, because you should be going back to the law always. The law is our friend and can guide us, but of course we get it wrong, and because there are many bear traps in it. So, hard bit out the way. So now we can relax and talk a bit more freely and a bit more relaxed way about neurodiversity. There is no one considered accepted definition of what neurodiversity is. There are plenty out there. To give you a couple of examples, so the Brain Charity says that neurodiversity is simply saying that each person has a brain that is unique to them. No two brains are quite alike, and for 1 million people in the UK, these differences mean that they are diagnosed with a condition such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, or another neurological condition. ACAS, in a very helpful research paper, I think it was 2015 they did this, but I will send this out for you to look at, said this: neurodiversity refers to the different ways the brain can work and interpret information. It highlights that people naturally think about things differently, and we have different interests, different motivations, and are naturally better at some things and poorer at others. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Where I'm fascinated on this subject is where neurodiversity and the different ways people think and interpret information and interpret other people's communication is where that fits into things like disciplinaries, grievances, because I'm pretty convinced, and I could be wrong, but I'm pretty convinced where you have personality clashes, people who just can't be managed, quote unquote, it's possible that somewhere along there, that person might be neurodivergent. And when we talk about neurodivergent people, we're simply saying that they have or could have a diagnosis of one of the neurodivergent conditions. And he says, there we are. So there is an example. That's not all of them. Maybe some of the top ones. There are plenty more. Ones that people tend to know about, I've heard of autism. People might say somebody's on the spectrum. ADHD, dyscalculia, and we'll look at these in a second. Dyslexia. Epilepsy surprised me. I must admit, I didn't realize epilepsy was considered as a neurodivergent issue. Different mental language disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, Tourette's and tic disorders. So there are always surprises for me, which is why it's such a fascinating subject, because it deals with neurology and how people interact with each other. So, as I say, these aren't all of them, but there are some great information out there. And certainly if you look at something like Autism Toolbox, which I can share all these with you, there's some great information in education, and education is really key, as I shall be saying frequently. So if we look at, I'm just going to pick three or four for ones that I think might come up. Autism, and this is a classic where people talk about someone being on the spectrum, and whether they are or they're not is a matter for medical people to decide, really. And I've chosen a very independent, if I can, symptom list, because I know there are different views, and one thing I would say is I don't pretend to be an expert in any of this. I just have an interest in it and have experience in it from an employment law perspective. So people with autism might find it hard to communicate and interact with other people. Well, in our jobs, we do that, don't we? Unless you have a job that's very insular. Find it hard to understand how people think or feel, so lack of empathy might be an issue. Might feel overwhelmed by bright lights and loud noises and find them stressful and uncomfortable. Get anxious or upset about unfamiliar situations. Take longer to understand information, and do the same things over and over and over. I don't know about you, but when I do this research and I do these talks, I keep thinking about people I work with, and I keep thinking, that's interesting. Or cases that I've dealt with where there was a conflict or a clash. And I just wonder how many undiagnosed issues there are in neurodiversity. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, generally categorized into two problems or issues: inattentiveness and hyperactivity and impulsiveness. There's a whole list there. Look at that. And that's from the NHS. And there may be many more. But from the workplace scenario, from our perspective, lack of attention to detail. You might have a manager having a problem. You know, this person just doesn't get it. They keep making mistakes. Poor organizational skills. That's me. Inability to focus or prioritize. Misplacing things. Mood swings, irritability. And you can see where these clashes happen. And as case law progresses in the employment tribunals and neurodiversity becomes further up the list, I think we're seeing more and more neurodivergent issues coming out and being recognised. Dyslexia is fairly common, and I think we would all probably know that that means that somebody may have an issue or a problem with confusing some words or phrases or letters and getting the wrong way around. There can be poor and inconsistent spelling. And in fact, I had the opposite of this when I managed somebody who had dyslexia. It says here that they understand information when told verbally, but difficulty when it's written down. She was the opposite. She needed it written down because she didn't understand it verbally. And that's really where this story started for me, having to deal with someone, manage someone who had dyslexia, which was fascinating. And dyscalculia is the numbers part of that. So somebody who may just have a problem with numbers. And there's a really key word there, or two key words, mathematics anxiety. And you'll see the word anxiety, when you more and more you research this, can come up more often than not. When we look at things like meltdowns or breakdowns or timeout and that sort of thing, where people with these neurodivergent issues can need that because of their anxiety. I'm going to show you a video. It's done by the BBC, and hopefully this is going to work. So the BBC have a fantastic department and a resource. You can Google it and find yourself, but I will, in the meantime, send it out to you as soon as I can. And they did a video. It's a gaming video, and I want to share some of it with you. I'm going to break it at some point. But what I suggest you do is put your earphones on or turn the volume up. It's done as a game, like an old sort of Pac-Man style game, but it gives you an idea of what someone with a neurodivergent diagnosis might feel about just coming into a normal office that many of us might be coming back to fairly shortly. So bear with me 1 second. Let's hope this is going to work. Amy and I did test this and all was well.
Good morning. Hey, you're right. Glad I caught you. Just in between meetings. Just wanted to have a quick catch up with you about the paper we were discussing the other day and the proposal that was sent through. I think this draft is really coming on. I think there's quite a few things in here that we need to double check. There's some stuff in the scope that I think needs fleshing out a bit, maybe make it a little bit smarter, stuff that we've discussed. And there's some of the stuff around cost benefit I think we need to double check here as well, because there's some bits in here that are kind of buried further back. I can't remember exactly where. But there's somewhere in here, and if we can bring them up to the front, I think that would be, it starts to become a really strong proposition. So sorry to sort of jump in on you, but I'll catch up with you later.
Okay, I'm going to pause it there and stop there purely because it's such a good place to stop for me, because I know I've been that man who was just doing that to that person. I literally vomit everything over them that I want them to try and take on board and expect them to understand. And then I expect them to go away and do it without actually explaining what it is. Sorry, and without actually explaining to them.
I didn't realize how many mistakes I was making in English
so
until I started to use Grammarly.
It's like having a proofreader and an English teacher right there.
Speaking English is way easier to me than writing it. Grammarly gives me confidence.
In Spanish, the way you say the words is the way you write it, but in English, that's not necessarily the case.
So my spelling, specific colons or semicolons.
Okay, so that gives you an idea of somebody with, we don't know what conditions they've got or what diagnosis they've got. It gives you an idea of what they might be experiencing. Even simply walking into the office can be anxious enough, but you've got beeps, you've got noises, loud bangs. And this person might be looking at the floor and might not be engaging with anyone. And so it may be this person comes across as rude or not engaging, or again, difficult to manage or won't take instructions. So I think the BBC's done a great job, and I'll send the link out of the work they've done, and that's on YouTube, free to share. And I think now and again, I look at that just to remind myself as to what some of the issues can be. It's fantastic, and they've done brilliant work on that. So is there a problem in the workplace? A problem in terms, almost this term negative, isn't it? What I mean, is there an issue? It wanted me to think about. Well, for me, when I first started this research, so I looked at it and I thought, well, what happens in the workplace? What conditions, for want of a better expression, do we have in the workplace? Mental health has had a big platform, quite rightly so, for a while now. And the statistic that is often said is 1 in 4 will have at least one diagnosable mental health problem in any given year. So that's a big problem, isn't it? Chronic migraine. I think we all know people with chronic migraines. We have them ourselves, perhaps. People we love and we care for may have them. 1 in 1,000. So that's actually, compared to mental health, it's quite big. But yet we'd be comfortable probably talking to someone about migraine and being able to relate to that because we have bad headaches. Asthma is another one. You know, someone saying I've got asthma, you might think, well, okay, I get that because you might use an inhaler. Or you might have a problem going from cold to hot, hot to cold, hay fever, maybe an allergy. I get that, dusty environments. But 1 in 7. So more than 15% of the UK are neurodivergent. So going back to our graphic, 1 in 7 could have 1 or more of those diagnoses. And that's only the ones that are actually diagnosed, because we'll go into diagnosis in a second. So that's probably a very conservative effort. So that says at the moment, there's a few people on this very call now who have a diagnosis on that graphic we saw, or who haven't had a diagnosis yet and may never have. So that's why I think I'm so passionate about, because it really, with these neurological conditions, it really, no pun intended, opens your mind to who you're actually talking to and dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And especially when dealing with those behavioural problems and those issues where people say, I don't get on with them, he's hard to manage. It just, all I'm really saying is broaden your mind and think. Not that you're not, but maybe think about neurodiversity and neurodivergent issues as well. There are comorbidities which can arise with these conditions. Anxiety and depression. I had a colleague who is in their 40s and they were recently diagnosed with autism. But they had their whole life, they said, experienced clashes with people, personality clashes, breakdowns in family. They couldn't get on with anybody. And we found it at work. This person was having problems at work. We were having informal grievances and people saying, I just can't manage this individual. The person saying, I don't like that person. They're very blunt and they wanted the rules followed. And it's very black and white. They're on the highest medication for anxiety, the highest medication for depression. And then through the school their son attended, there was concerns about autism. And it highlighted this person, oh, I wonder. And they got a diagnosis. They got a private diagnosis, and it really opened their minds. And one of the things with adults who are diagnosed, I think often they will say, now things make sense. The past makes sense. Some of the clashes I've had, some of the problems I've had now make sense. Okay, but comorbidities can also be different. There might be social isolation. People might not want to go out. They might not want to engage. And that's fine, but it may well be because they're scared of upsetting people. If they're having a life or a work life where they're constantly upsetting people or being upset, then they might not want to go out and attend things. And that can lead to social exclusion and isolation. And just think about lockdown and transition for a second. Think about lockdown. I mean, all of us, I'm sure, have had some anxiety about lockdown. You know, back in March last year, it was get your box and go home. And now Boris tells us that in 2 weeks' time, Corona's gone and we can all rush back to the office, which is wonderful news. However, for someone who may well be dealing with some of those issues that we saw on the graphic, this could be really, really frightening. And as HR, it's our job, isn't it, to look out for those people, to try and include everyone as much as we can do. And so the thing I flag is, yes, we have the statistic about mental health, and we have mental health first aiders and all the provision. But neurodiversity is something to be really alive to. And encouraging people to come forward is a problem, as we shall see, but it's something to be alive to, especially when you're dealing with these changes, because changes and clashes tend to be one or two of the top triggers that can bring these issues to the fore. Okay. Diagnosis, it can be an issue, and for anyone who's experienced this in the virtual room, I'm sure they say the same. But you know, some of the stories I hear, even from the child perspective, getting a diagnosis can be an issue, and for adults, that tends to mean they may go privately, and who that diagnosis comes from is also potentially contentious, because some of these conditions can be broad and unspecified. So it's not always quite as simple as saying, have you got a diagnosis? What are you diagnosed with? Because there can be various disorders, for a better expression, on the spectrum, for example, that even experts might disagree with. So we need to be careful about how we phrase that. Have you got a diagnosis? Or a better phrase might be, did you ever have any help with schoolwork? So you're looking for a door to go in, as opposed to banging and saying, what's your diagnosis? Disclosure is also not as prevalent as it should be, because coming forward to your boss, HR, or your employer, especially in a small employer, saying, hey, by the way, I've got autism, I've just been diagnosed with autism or something, can be very scary, especially when dealing with those comorbidities as well. So disclosure does not necessarily get you off knowledge, though. And when we look at disability, when we come back to our claims, there is defence, because if the employer simply had no idea that the individual who's claiming was disabled or had any symptoms, that can amount to a defence, and a fairly safe defence. Because it's only if the employer has knowledge of the disability can they then discriminate or fail to make reasonable adjustments. But you need to be careful here, because knowledge can be imputed. So we have imputed or constructed knowledge, where a tribunal can look at it and say, but it must have been obvious to you that there was a problem. It must have been obvious that there was an issue, and what did you do about it? And the classic tends to be, you have probably been with an individual who's been with you for many, many years, and they start having time off. And we all know the story, don't we? And the warnings we give and the training we give to our colleagues about depression, for example. And something changes, the individual might start breaking down, they might be tearful, they can't cope with things. And so we'd be thinking of mental health. But what about somebody who is clashing all the time with somebody? And we're not talking about people who are quite frankly just a pain, because we know they do exist, don't we? We can be open about that. Some people just don't like rules. And quite frankly, people who will be there to be a thorn in your side because that's what they just like doing. We're not talking about those people. We're talking about people who can't help it because of the way they view the world and the way they interpret information, and even interpret faces and vocal expressions and instructions to them. So it's about broadening our mind and thinking, what should I know, or what can I investigate and find out with this individual or this problem? And the response is vital, because we'll see in a minute with the case of Empower, the response is not, I've got a policy for that, I'm going to follow that policy, and I'm going to fit the policy around you. Simple as that. We're going to follow the policy word for word, because that is a very blunt instrument, and tribunals don't like it. So the response is about being empathetic and supportive, but it really comes down to education and evidence as well. If we've got education in this, and if we're alive to neurodiversity and those who are neurodivergent, then we're going to have a better way of looking at this, and we have a broader interpretation of what else might be going on. I'm not going to go through all of these, but essentially the anticipate is the most important one. These are best practice generally, as I said at the start, to avoid claims. We can all do those things on paper, but of course in reality, we know in HR things are very, very different. It's a fast moving environment, everyone's different. You might have someone who's off sick, and you're getting those repeated fit notes. And you don't really know what that means, and you're trying to investigate, but it all looks easy on paper. But when we say anticipate, the cases that I've looked at and seen and dealt with, neurodivergent people tend to come forward or tend to present with issues when change happens or is about to happen, like redundancies, or where there is a clash, where there's a failure to follow instruction, where they don't understand instruction, or they're just becoming unmanageable according to the manager. Because then you'll find that unions in particular, I'm finding, what my suspicion is they're being quite well trained in this, because there's been 2 cases I've seen recently where there's a union rep who has said to the individual they're accompanying to the meeting, have you ever thought about a diagnosis of X, Y, and Z? Because you seem to fit one or two of the symptoms. And this might be someone in their 40s or 50s. And we'll see in the case of Elliott in a second, this is someone in their 50s, I think. And so your unions may be more onto this than you are, alive to it, and your managers might not be. And of course, HR, we're here just to try and guide and advise our managers. But one of the things we might be thinking about is, again, that phrase, what else is going on? What do I know about the individual? What don't I know about the individual? When you're dealing with change and redundancies, like returning to the office, for example, having neurodivergent people on your radar and adjusting the way we do things is only going to help. And be aware that even if you're not aware of these issues, then union reps may well be, depending on the training they've received. So we've covered a lot and we're blasting through a lot. Apologies if it's quick, but I'm flagging these up and I think it's being recorded. You can always go over and look at it, and I will send out a summary afterwards. But occupational health, I don't know about you, I tend to have a mixed view on occupational health depending on who I've got, and it's a bit of a gamble. Sadly, in my experience, occupational health can be very bland. We've all had those, I'm sure, where there simply is no commitment either way. Is this person disabled? Well, there might be. It's for a tribunal, not for me. Well, yeah, we realise that. We need to give us a steer. I don't know, simply because I've had not enough experience of it, how experienced, shall we say, occupational health doctors or advisors are going to be on neurodiversity. I'm sure it's on their radar and they're trained in it. But maybe, as employers and HR, we need to be thinking about asking more clear questions and perhaps more directed questions. Only after, I suggest, you have discussed that and raised that with the employee potentially, as you should be with occupational health reports anyway. You will also find that it may not be a doctor of a specific speciality who gets involved in diagnosis. It might be psychologists, it might be psychiatrists, it might be different speciality doctors who have to get involved to deal with different diagnoses, because some of them can be extremely complicated and multifaceted, and you may need expert help. In terms of a claim, you will find a tribunal might, they don't like to, but tribunals might be willing to order maybe a joint expert to comment on this. If it's not clear what's going on, or if it's not clear when the employer had knowledge due to the way that neurodivergent individuals present with the diagnosis, it may not be abundantly clear. So be aware and be prepared for GPs in particular to say, I don't know, is the answer to that. Or they might be being referred to an expert for diagnosis, and you need to be alive to that and watch that red flag. And the final thing to say on occupational health reports generally is you don't always have to agree. The leading cases are quite clear. Gallup is one that you may be aware of, where the tribunal is very clear. Don't just rubber stamp occupational health reports. Just because the doctor says someone's disabled or not disabled doesn't mean the employer says, great, I'll follow that blithely. You have to give some thought and think to yourself objectively, what do I say on the evidence before me? And that's our role. We talked about workplace toolkits a moment ago, and it's something I'm really keen on. I think they're great. And Mind, the mental health charity, does a great one for mental health. I've done one for a colleague who's now left, who had a severe nut allergy, who had anaphylaxis, and we had a treatment that we call it a treatment emergency plan, where it was on his file, and the first aiders were briefed with this document about what to do, because it was a quite extreme nut allergy and how to work. And I think what's developed on from that in the neurodiversity scheme of things is passports. So if this works, and it did with Amy and I earlier, so keep your fingers crossed. So this is one designed and created by the Northeast Autistic Society. And it's as it says on the tin, it's a passport about me. So this might be an individual who is neurodivergent, who has a diagnosis, and might not want to keep talking about it, but wants HR to know, wants their manager to know, all the first aiders to know, or the mental health first aiders to know. And it is quite simple. It does what it says on the tin. It talks about the condition. And communication, especially with autism, is really important, because an autistic person might not want face-to-face contact. They might get very nervous or anxious about that, but actually they're fine on email or vice versa. We all interpret information in different ways. I'm very visual. If you give me a black and white document, I tend to fall asleep, which for a lawyer is quite worrying. But you give me visual and colours, I tend to absorb it more. Information to be given, it says there, how do you want to be informed about things? It gives them an option. And things that increase my anxiety, this is really important. And this might explain why, without having to ask the person why they might not be coming to things, why they might feel nervous in training. Doesn't mean they want to sit in a certain space during training or a meeting, or do they want more time to do things? So you can see there, this is a great way really to document everything. And they'll also tell you about situations they find difficult, because every neurodivergent person will have different triggers and different anxious moments they want to try and avoid or manage as best they can. And there's a reasonable adjustment. So this is a great way. The Union Unite, or no, the GMB, forgive me, has also done one. That's very complicated. I don't mind it. This one is really simple. So if you've got someone with a new diagnosis, and we're dealing with adults, of course, not children, a new diagnosis, maybe this is something to mention. You know, it could form perhaps part of your neurodiversity policy or your procedure, or maybe your neurodiversity champion, if you have one, that they could be aware of these, because it's a great way of documenting how people want to have to be dealt with. Okay. I just want to cover two cases, and I want to cover two of them is because, and this is really awkward because the people who are in HR, I don't know who's here. There's a number of people here, and there may be people involved in this case. We're in this, or here with me now. I'm sure they're not. This isn't a criticism, because one of the things about being the other side of the desk with you, I'm not a lawyer who sits there saying, well, just do this. This is what the law says. I'm aware that things happen and mistakes happen. And in the case of NPower, it's quite clear the way the tribunal viewed this. Mr. Sherborne had autism, and he struggled, as autistic people can do, with noisy environments. He was made to sit in an open plan office in a very busy walkway behind him, which is distracting for a lot of people, but for someone with autism, may well be incredibly distracting and causing anxiety. It was a flexible work environment, which meant you never knew what desk you were turning up to. Again, that transition back to work from lockdown, you'll be thinking about that, and how this might affect somebody like Mr. Sherborne. Needless to say, the response was caring to an extent, but unfortunately the manager just literally hits Mr. Sherborne around the face with the policy. This is the policy, this is what we follow, this is what we do. So the policy was being used in a very blunt instrument way. And there wasn't really much of an effort, sadly, to go to the raw bones of what the disability was. What were the symptoms and how can we manage this? How can we deal with the disability and make the reasonable adjustments? The policy was just literally thrown unfollowed. And I think the tribunal sums it up here when it says the detrimental action was a continuous management failure, and that failure was to take reasonable steps to understand the claimant's disability. I think pausing there and digesting, again, for me as a manager and someone in charge of HR, that really hits home, because as lawyers, as we all are deep down as HR people, we look at the law and we have our policies and we draft them, but at the end of the day, we're dealing with human beings with very different neurological takes on things and interpretations. So reasonable steps to understand the claimant's disability and mixing up welfare and capability, which you can read about in there. Elliott is the most recent case, and actually I should point out that the NPower case was an employment tribunal case, and as I'm sure you're aware, be careful if you do search employment tribunal cases, be aware that tribunals do not bind other tribunals. Judge Fred doesn't have to follow Judge Smith, okay? But where you have an employment appeal tribunal case, it's binding. So Elliott was a very recent case back in February. I know the barrister who did, I won't tell you which side it was, but I know the barrister, and this was a very difficult case. So Mr. Elliott was autistic, but he didn't know he had a diagnosis until very late on in the process, funny enough. But you'll see what should be red flags, but they're actually yellow arrows, look. Change and communication issues. Okay, so what happened here, very long story short, and please do read the case, and I'll tell you why you should for two reasons in a minute. Mr. Elliott was a long-standing employee of Dorset County Council. From memory, I think he had an unblemished record. He had a manager, probably quite old school, who simply said to him, if you don't want to work during the day, or I agree if you don't want to work during the day, you can work in the night. Mr. Elliott was a very hardworking, or is a very hardworking individual, and he says in his statement he used to work till midnight, 1 in the morning, and his wife would tell him frequently to stop working and to stop. But then if he didn't work during the day, his view would be, well, I've made up my hours. So it sounds to me as if there wasn't really a flex work policy in place or an agreement, but it was generally agreed through the manager face to face. And Mr. Elliott, due to his diagnosis, literally took the view, you can do X, Y, and Z as I can do X, Y, and Z. And that's it. It's black and it's white. In comes the new manager. And at the same time, in comes redundancy. So we have that change. Anxiety levels go up. Mr. Elliott's worried. He has a new manager who comes in and says, well, hang on a minute, what are you doing? We get to the point where there's disciplinary action for failing to be at work and not doing the hours. And you've got to see where this is going. And Mr. Elliott says, well, hang on a minute, no, I agreed before that I didn't have to do that. During the disciplinary process, because he was disciplined for this, it was the union rep who said to Mr. Elliott, I wonder if, have you ever thought about, you seem to match some of the descriptions of someone with, and he ended up getting a diagnosis. Now, this has been remitted back to a fresh employment tribunal because Judge Taylor in the Employment Appeal Tribunal, I'm sure it's Judge Taylor, was unfortunately quite open about his views on the way the judge dealt with it in the Employment Tribunal, and also the way that two of the barristers dealt with it as well, but that's another thing. There we go, that's what we want. So the Employment Tribunal decided, because this obviously, the level of detail that went in the tribunal was about, is Mr. Elliott disabled or not? The Employment Tribunal judge said no. Part of the problem, according to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, Judge Taylor, was that the judge was focusing on the wrong part. Because when we go back a few slides, and I won't, but back in our earlier slides, we talked about the substantial impairment on daily living, didn't we? We have to get our definition. If you don't meet the definition, there is simply no claim. The issue with Mr. Elliott and with a lot of people who are neurodivergent is what we call masking, or when they have coping strategies. And they are ways that people will mask or they will hide their condition and their symptoms to go along with what looks normal. And by normal, what we say is neurotypical. Someone who's neurotypical doesn't have any of those conditions or diagnosis. So what was happening, Mr. Elliott was avoiding things that caused him stress, or was having coping strategies. And I would probably say this is a bit like antidepressants. So someone with depression, if it's serious enough, it can amount to disability under the Equality Act for employment law purposes. If they take medication, antidepressants, if they make them feel very well, and they very rarely have any exacerbations of the depression, we can't say, because we know that, well, you're fine, you're not disabled because you're fine. Because the antidepressants are helping the person to feel better. If you take the antidepressants away, they would be exhibiting some of the symptoms with someone in depression, and the argument about whether they have disability or not probably wouldn't arise. Now, the thing with neurodiversity is that it's generally invisible for most people. Because it's invisible, they might know that they're exhibiting these symptoms, but also they may have developed coping strategies to deal with them in the workplace, especially in public life, because they're anxious and worried. Now, what Judge Taylor said in the EAT, and this is really critical, is that a coping strategy can, of course, break down when under stress, like change. But a coping strategy should be taking into account when you're thinking about the impact of the impairment, going back to that legislative language, okay? And the key point, if a claimant has significantly altered his day-to-day activities or avoids some of those activities, that doesn't mean he's not disabled, because he's adapting his life. Read Elliott. It's a really interesting case on a case study of autism and where it can go wrong, understandably. But also, it's a very good case to refresh your mind and remind you how to deal with the Section 6 definition, because Judge Taylor is quite clear. I'm sure, forgive me if it wasn't Judge Taylor, I'm sure it was. But EAT is telling us, as HR advisors, if you have an impairment that has a substantial impact on daily living, stop. Because what we lawyers do, and it's us who've got it wrong, we go further, we look at the code, and then we look at other things in case law to question that. EAT is saying, but you don't need to. The Section 6 language is enough, you can stop there. So please read it, Elliott. It's a great case for CPD. So moving on to disclosure, it's not always expressed. Someone's not always going to come to you like I did with me and said, hey, look, I've got a diagnosis of autism. Can I talk to you about it? It may be multifaceted and is likely to be. So mental health, EMH, it may come up in mental health. Somebody might be suffering from anxiety. They might have depression. They might have other things going on. It could be a dodgy elbow, but as sick leave goes on, more and more investigation comes out, and you're uncovering more and more and more. Disciplinaries and grievances are classics. The disciplinaries, depending on the reason, of course, personality clashes, management problems, the unmanageable, as they're termed sometimes. Just think, take a step back. I wonder if, have I ever thought about? How you address that little individual is difficult, and I grant you that. You can't go up to them and say, hey, do you think you're autistic? We couldn't do that, and you've got to be careful not to undermine trust and confidence and have a constructive dismissal if you go down like that. But maybe finding words or phrases to open that door once the door is open, to ask more. And remember, you might be told in a tribunal, but you should have known. Where were the symptoms? Where were the signs? And what did you do about it? I'm not going to go too much into the response, but essentially, and I'm teaching you to suck eggs, I'm sure, consultation is key with an individual, and advice. Consultation and advice are the two most important things when you have a disclosure or where you think something is going on. There should be no surprises in an occupational health report, because my view, the best practice is telling the person what you're going to ask. They've got a right to see it anyway, so tell them. Raising neurodivergent issues is delicate and difficult, but there might be ways to do it delicately. It might be through OH. OH might be your answer or the way in to look at some of these issues. With personality clashes, it may well be, is there an underlying cause? And the OH classic, they might be looking at depression or something, or stress, but is there another way you can ask it that may uncover other issues going on? Positive steps. This is really simple, I think, from my own experience. I have to say, I dealt with a client fairly recently, and I was helping him with somebody who had dyslexia. And this is a chap in his 50s running a £6 million company. He turned around and said to me, "Isn't dyslexia for people who are just thick?" Now, I won't tell you my response I wanted to say, but it's about educating. And I think there is a difficulty here. When you speak to people who are neurodivergent or those who care for them, they just want to be heard, and they want people to know this is invisible, but it's real. So no, it's not for people who are thick. It's not just an excuse for longer exam times. This is real. There are neurological conditions, and when we think about asthma, depression, migraines, it's just as real as those, which is why I'm passionate about talking about it. One area you might want to look at, and it certainly opened my eyes after going a few courses and talking to people and researching this more, is our traditional approach to interviews. And maybe because there's so much experience in the virtual room now, I'm sure there'll be different approaches on this in views. But our traditional interview, you come in, I'm not going to tell you what it's going to look like. You wear your suit, or you come in suited and booted, and I'm going to fire questions at you, and you will answer them. Now, the BBC did a presentation on this, and one of their fantastic media people said, "I would never have got my job if I'd had a traditional interview." And it made me wonder, who are we recruiting? Or who do I want to recruit? If I'm just firing questions at someone, I sometimes wonder, do I just want another me? But with neurodiversity, and we'll see with a wonderful video in a minute, it brings so much freshness and so much talent to your workplace. But maybe, how about disclosing the interviews first? How about telling them, giving them a chance to give written responses? I'm just going to mention one thing which I really want you to have a look at, which I haven't got time to show you, but I want you to be aware of, is it's similar to the passporting, where there is a plan for someone who is coming in for an interview. It looks similar to this, but you'll see there's a plan about who you're going to meet, maybe the photos of them, and I'll send that out to you. But really do look at that. It's called a workplace plan or an interview plan. It's really, really great. Okay. Educate is important, because I needed to educate myself, and I thought I pretty much knew all things employment law, and I didn't. Review recruitment as a starter. Encourage disclosure. How are you going to deal with disclosure? What policy you've got in place? But education, I think, is really important. I'm going to stop there because I want to show you a video. Probably won't get through all of it, so I know Amy needs a couple of minutes just to go over a couple of things. But it's something given by HSBC. It's on YouTube. It's fantastic. I love this video because it really shows the talent diversity that can be brought. And then I'm going to stop. I won't play all of it, but I'll just show you a couple of bits if that's okay. And Amy doesn't shout at me for going over. So please bear with me. It's a great video, but I promise you I won't show all of it. It's only 4 minutes long, but we will cut that out for some questions to deal with.
If a person were to say to me, "Wow, you're really good at thinking about concepts," for example, the equivalent of that for me would be to say to a person, "Wow, you're really good at breathing."
People think that you're thick.
They think that I can't read.
That we're dumb, that we're slow, we're uneducable. Actually, it's quite the opposite.
I'm neurodiverse because I am autistic.
I have something that's called Asperger syndrome, which is an autistic spectrum disorder.
I'm dyslexic.
I have Asperger's syndrome.
I'm dyslexic, and I also have dysgraphia.
I have dyslexia and dyscalculia.
I got an ADHD diagnosis a few years ago, and it was actually the first time in my life that I made sense to myself.
I just think it's the way my brain's wired up.
Just wired differently.
I am not seeing what everyone else is seeing, There's obviously a huge advantage to that, but we've only learned to appreciate this potential over the last few years.
One way of understanding neurodiversity is if we've got people who we call normal, we call them neurotypical, they can see the visual spectrum of colours going from red to indigo. Neurodiverse people, they might not be able to see blue, but they can see in infrared. Now you've got somebody in your team who can see in the dark. Do you want to have that person in your team? Of course you do.
Many of my strengths, I believe, come from my autism.
I'm good at retaining knowledge. I know where to find the knowledge.
My brain is incredibly logical. One of my main traits is I can take lots of different sort of level 2D drawings and then make them into a 3D model in my head and be able to spin them around.
I'm very good at spatial things. I built a kitchen in our house 12 years ago, bought all the bits from IKEA and fitted the whole thing. And somebody said to me, well, where did you make a plan of that? I didn't. I did it all in my head.
So ADHD is basically like watching 30 different channels.
Okay, I'm going to stop there because that always annoys me. How he built a kitchen with no plan is amazing because I can't even build a drawer. So, but hopefully that's a nice positive to end on. I can't see faces, but I hope some of the line there's been some smiles and maybe some minds open a bit. And I hope with me that you also step out of today just thinking a bit more, for want of a better expression. This is a great subject, it's fascinating. But thank you for listening. I think Amy's got something to say, and there might be some questions. If I can, and if I can't, I promise I've spoken for too long. I'll try and answer them afterwards. I'll stop sharing, Amy.
That's okay, we'll whiz through some of the questions, but thanks for that, Robin. I'm in absolute awe of your passion and knowledge about this subject. It's amazing, so thank you. So let's have a quick look through the questions and see what we can get through. So somebody has asked, what was the Judge Taylor case reference?
I'll send it out. Sorry, yeah. I will. Well, I can tell you now if you like. It's it's Elliott. Well, which one? We've got there were NPAT. So it's forgive me. Sherborne, SHERBOURNE, and then V and N-Power Limited. If you just Google, that's a 2018 case. It should be there. On the internet, but I will send these out as links as soon as I can.
Okay.
Michaela, I'm sorry, I speak too fast. Sorry.
What I'm going to do is actually screenshot these questions and comments, and as Robin said, he will do a follow-up note responding to those questions because we are running out of time. I'm just conscious of time. So just to close the call, just want to say we'll send out some correspondence to people that have signed up for the event, and I'll put a post on LinkedIn over the next few days. If you could comment and share the post, that'd be great. If you do have LinkedIn, as we don't charge for these events and it just raises our brand awareness. We also have a guild networking group for HR professionals. I think a lot of you are probably signed up to it now, but for those of you that aren't, I'll also include that link onto the email because it's really picking up momentum. So and finally, if anyone is recruiting, obviously we have accountancy recruit and FD recruit under the group as well as HR recruit, so feel free to contact me and I can put you in contact with relevant consultants. And finally, just a massive thank you, Robin. It's been brilliant. I've really enjoyed today's session, and thank you to all our listeners for tuning in.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you very much.